Harvest Days are our annual get-together and brings together researchers from across the ASSR, so from 7 different disciplines and 4 departments. Now we decided to focus on our home city. And so this also means that we really speak to our relationship with people in the city, with organizations in the city. And so it was an occasion for us to showcase and also reflect upon the many collaborations we have with stakeholders in Amsterdam.
Thank you very much for this invitation and also for presenting our work on the political representation of minorities in Amsterdam. It is very much I'm representing a much larger group. So therefore I think it's good that we are here at the Harvest Day representing work that has been done in the Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies at the ASSR for the last 30 years. And there are many colleagues, also some of them are present in the room today, that have been working on this. And it's nice to sort of show what we've done to some extent and also see to what extent that also is important and relevant for discussions about the city today that we can also then discuss later with Younes Douari in the after talk. So it's not only my work, but it's also the colleagues like Menet Venema and Jean Telly who started this project, but Anja van Hilsum, Marcel Maus, Lisa Muke, and also some colleagues from ONS. Laura Michaud and Sjoerdje van Heerden were also part of a larger team that worked on this, and so many more colleagues have been studying this. And I guess the central question of this large program was the question, what happens, politically speaking, in a city that changes through migration? And to what extent is the city, the political system, able to absorb these newcomers and their children? And if you look at that over time, what do we see happening in Amsterdam? And it was quite a very simple model, you could say, that we started with, thinking about, okay, participation leads to representation, and then obviously, hopefully, representation leads to influence also in the political system.
We know from a lot of studies in the US, for instance, that this not happen automatically. So it's not something that's automatically will happen once you have immigration. Once you have to go settling into the city because it will become part of the political system. We have examples where the political system excludes for generations newcomers to the system and it's not really able to absorb it. A lot of the studies that we're doing has been focused on Amsterdam. You all very much to understand what is the role of the city in all this. And Amsterdam, of course, also provides us with an opportunity to compare all the time, but also to compare groups, see whether it matters, where some groups may have particular characteristics and that might help them to integrate into put easily, or it might also be up. It was very much a case in point, and I want to show you some of those results and thinking a bit about what it means for the current situation in the city, and then also discuss with Younes what they could do about problems we still very much see happen in. Before I present Amsterdam as a case itself, I want to say a few words about the representation. It is important to also understand that very much understand this formal representation through election as the primary locus of power in the local democratic system.
So formal representation very much is the primary locus. Even though obviously we experience all kinds of problems with representative democracy, we are very much frustrated with a lot of the things that are happening. We still feel that through elections, power dynamics really are established, and we need to focus on that. In that sense, also descriptive representation, as we call it, for minorities really matters, right? So this is about to what extent do we see politicians with a migration background itself being present in these bodies, in city council, also being governing the city. Recently, we have been studied more and more, let's say, the perceived political representation. So thinking more about, okay, it's not only the objective representation, the extent to which these people are present, but also it's about to what extent do people with a migration background feel that they belong, that they are heard, they are seen by the political system, and that they are part of the political system. So it's a more subjective element that's also very much present in a lot of the studies. In that sense, obviously also what we've been studying in the last decades is that, yes, descriptive representation matters. It's the first step, but it's not necessarily leading to more substantial representation. And this is also something that we are very much interested in studying further to see what are the ways in which descriptive representation leads to more substantive ways of representation. And next to that, I think also it's very important to understand and to study more direct democracy instruments as they become more important, not so much as a substitute for this formal representation, but much more as a way to further strengthen the political system. So let me very briefly say something about Amsterdam. I guess most of you know about the city and know about the demographic and political characteristics, but it's good to sort of highlight some of these elements. And first, obviously, the migration part. Right? So if we look at this, it's the light blue, that's the foreign migration balance, and the dark blue is the domestic migration balance. And what we see is that people were leaving the city in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but there were also a lot of people settling in the city, coming from abroad. And the same for the 80s, and especially also in the last 10 years, where we see more and more people settling from especially EU countries into Amsterdam. And again, we see also people leaving the city in that particular period. The consequences of all this, also thinking about the fact that in 1960 there was almost no migration background people living in the city. Nowadays it's almost 60%. And migration background here means that either yourself are being born abroad or at least one of your parents. And we see many different nationalities, and we see obviously also many different groups. And from this migration background, roughly 60% is an actual immigrant themselves, and the other 40% are children of immigrants. So it's very much sort of our interest here is like, what did the political system do? How did they react to this very strong demographic developments? Especially in a context which, on paper at least, is quite favorable to group representation. So participation is relatively easy and quickly leads to descriptive representation. And you have to think about the local voting rights for immigrants, for EU citizens, and also about the proportional system, and also voting for specific candidates makes it much easier in our system to be represented compared to some other European countries, cities. So, for instance, it takes only 7,000 votes in Amsterdam to get a seat in city council, and also it allows groups to mobilize in that capacity. At the same time, it's also important to think that the political parties here are very much gatekeepers, right? So on paper, the system might seem very accessible, but it all depends on how political parties deal with that situation. So to give a brief overview of what we studied, and of course there are so many different things to tell you here, so there are more than 10 PhD theses that we have published and produced, more than 50 academic articles. If you look at the PhD thesis, also recently, Sanne van Oosten, Sarah Rundekamp, Judith de Jong, led by projects of Lisa Muge, were defended recently. And the different topics that we studied in these 30 years, they really started with a very famous article in our field by Meijnerd Venema and Jean Tilly that looked at the political participation and political trust in Amsterdam, very much taking the social capital approach. To thinking that those groups that have more social capital, that have more organizations, more networks, will probably be able to mobilize and participate more, and that will lead to more representation. So we have been studying together with ONS in the last 35 years political participation, voting behavior of Amsterdam residents with a migration background. We have studied the impact of the city on these things by comparing it to other Dutch cities, other European cities, and also cities beyond Europe. We have looked at different determinants, what exactly fosters particular forms of political behavior. We have studied the perceived political representation of different groups. And we have not only looked at formal politics, but also very much at informal forms of political participation, thinking about civic and religious participation of different immigrant communities, and we studied many, many more. I want to highlight a few things sort of coming from the base of the project by Mendes, Venema, and Gentili to think about what exactly did these civic networks, the social capital, had an effect on the way in which people participated. And one of the things that we did was we tried to measure turnout rates of different immigrant groups. We focus here on the Turkish Amsterdammers, the Moroccan Amsterdammers, and the Surinamese Amsterdammers. And we see some very interesting things in the last 30 years. First of all, in the beginning, some groups at least were quite enthusiastic about the right to vote. We see high levels of turnout, even sometimes higher than the average. At the same time, it is interesting to see that the Surinamese Amsterdammers who came here as Dutch nationals with speaking the language were much less enthusiastic, right? They already were familiar with Dutch politics from the way in which the colonial regime operated in their country of origin, and didn't really show a lot of interest in participating. At the same time, I feel that the model that was presented by Mendes, Venema, and Gentili did work quite well, because we do see that some groups with high levels of social capital, with networks, with organizations, were able to mobilize if they felt it was important. So the Turkish Amsterdammers show relatively high levels of political participation in different elections. Something else that we studied, and this is just one example, is we looked at, okay, did people also vote for candidates with a similar migration background? And here we find similar differences between groups, but also the context is quite important, because here we look at not only whether they voted for a particular candidate, but also whether the neighborhood in which these people lived has a higher concentration of other migrants with a similar migration background. And we see indeed it works, again, for the Turkish Amsterdammers, where if they live in neighborhoods with relatively high level concentration of other Turkish Amsterdammers, they are more willing to vote for candidates with a Turkish background. And it's also obviously a two-way process where parties and candidates also visit those neighborhoods more. Where if you look at the Surinamese Amsterdammers, this pattern is not present. Far from it. If you look at neighborhoods with a high percentage of Surinamese people, we see even less people voting for candidates with a similar migration background. Obviously, as I said, in the political system that we have, this leads to higher levels of descriptive representation for specific groups, especially the Turkish Amsterdammers. If you consider the fact that this is a relatively small group in the city, they are very much overrepresented in city council compared to some of the other communities. But overall, you could say that there is high levels of descriptive representation in the city council, 20%, and recently even much higher. And this is high level compared to other Dutch cities, other European cities, and even some of American cities. So in that sense, the system works. But if we then sort of look further and also look more recently, we also see that this is clearly not the complete story, right? So social capital leads to descriptive representation, but does it also lead to more substantive representation? And here I want to sort of show on an article that Laure Michon and myself published more than 10 years ago, where we said, yes, it does work for the participation and descriptive representation, but social capital also leads to lower levels of political influence, especially in hostile political environments, as political parties very often, as the gatekeepers of the system, perceive these communities as more threatening. Right? So they tend to not select candidates from those communities, but also look for other migrant communities on their candidate list. So social capital leads to both political inclusion, but also very much political exclusion. And obviously, the people themselves have already experienced this much more. And that's also illustrated, for instance, if we look at the political voting patterns of different groups. I take here the Turkish Amsterdammers as an example, where in 2006, more than 80% still voted for the Labour Party. And also, if you think that was an election where they had high levels of turnout rates, so they were very important for that political party. But then in the years following that, they clearly were much frustrated and disappointed by the party, and were looking for other parties. And this new party, Denk, basically took over the place of Labour Party, because then in 2018, almost 80% of the Turkish Amsterdammers voted for that particular party. So yes, on the one hand, the system works, but at the same time, clearly, the parties as gatekeepers also have an important influence in that. And it's not only the Turkish Amsterdammers, but we see very similar patterns for groups with less social capital, like the Surinamese Amsterdammers, voting 80% for Labour Party in 2006, and then almost 50% in 2018 for Bijeen. So also there we see a similar pattern happening that can be understood by the frustration and disappointed by these voters in terms of the mainstream parties. Another important thing that we have studied and highlighted in the last years is that we see an increasing inequality in turnout rates in the city itself. So very high turnout in the wealthy center, south of the city, 80%, sometimes 90%. But then in the more poor areas where we see a higher concentration of people with a migration background, lower and lower turnout rates, sometimes even below 20%. So a lot of the people there in those neighborhoods basically, for very good reasons, decided not to vote and to be participating in that political system. In combination with the fact that in those neighborhoods, people also tend to vote differently than in the wealthy parts of the city. And this makes it even more problematic. So here we can think of political scientists like Leiphardt, who already warned for this in the 90s, saying that it's not so much the average turnout that is important, but much more the inequality in the city or in the country that we should worry about, in combination with the fact that people think about things differently and vote for different parties. Obviously, the question is, why do we find these lower levels of participation? And there are a lot of research done by us, but also by colleagues, come with similar reasons. There's little or no interest or knowledge of local politics, but very much also the feeling of not being seen or heard by local politicians. So the idea my vote doesn't really matter is very much important to a lot of the respondents of those projects. And high levels of distrust for politics in more general terms. And when you look at sort of the characteristics of groups that participate less, we see age as being important, education, and migration background, and especially in combination, we see that these groups have the least likelihood to vote. And also that is illustrated by the pictures that we just showed in terms of the neighborhoods that have low turnout rates. So what explains these high levels of distrust and low participation? Something that we studied more recently in a large project done with colleagues from Nijmegen and with the Sociaal Cultureel Planbureau. In a report, Is de politiek er voor iedereen? We illustrated the importance of discrimination. Both perceived social and political exclusion are strongly correlated. So people who often experience discrimination more often feel that they are not represented by politics and then have less trust in politics. And this is a strong correlation that is demonstrated in various national databases, but also in local projects that we have been conducting here in Amsterdam as well. What is interesting there is to see that it has two specific consequences. On the one hand, it leads to people not participating, right? So being frustrated, don't think that their vote matters, so they will not be participating in formal politics anymore. On the other hand, it can also mobilize groups in their frustration to vote for different parties that represent their interest. So parties like DENK, Bijeen or NIDA really sort of cater to this particular group. So there's a different outcome there. So to wrap up, so what did we find? So to what extent did the Amsterdam political system was able to absorb the changes since 1960? I would say overall the picture is very disappointing, especially if we have on paper such a favorable context, right? So there's increasing participative inequality, there is an increasing political fragmentation, there are high levels of political distrust, and we see that this idea of descriptive representation not leading automatically to substantive representation is very much part of the pattern that we observe. There are some positive signs that we can also perhaps discuss later with Eunice. So yes, we do see a lot of politicians with a migration background, also in the city council currently in Amsterdam. Yes, we do see the emergence of new parties representing the interests of specific minority groups. And yes, we do see a civil society that is very dynamic and successful, also in those neighborhoods with low turnout. And it could be that we also find in that capacity solutions by strengthening those civic networks in those neighborhoods to be able to increase the mobilization and also the representation of those groups. Another thing which I would also very much like to discuss with Yunus is how to make sure that political parties reflect more on their role as representatives of particular groups, especially those underrepresented groups that feel very much not part of the political system. And to end my presentation, I want to sort of show some sort of further steps for research that we are currently already doing. So for the coming local elections, we will again with ONS together do research during the elections. I think for the first time we decided not to focus on Amsterdammers with a migration background. We have studied them now for 30 years. There's nothing new that we can find. So we say, well, let's go for young people in specific city districts with low turnout to also see what are the dynamics there. I feel also with colleagues like Femke Koningsvrex, Nanke Verloo, Sherifa Redam and Judith Jong and Martien Kuitenbrouwer to focus much more on more direct forms of democracy, especially in those neighborhoods with low turnout. What can we learn from that? How can we sort of combine it with more formal politics that is happening? We are currently also working on a special issue for urban studies, bringing together different disciplines, different people from different contexts, thinking about the importance of organizations and urban inequality. There is more and more data available, also quantitatively, the National Election Survey, but also other databases that we can use. Together with Sarah Rundekamp and Henk van der Kolk, we are working on that. Also to get a better sense of how political parties deal with different contexts. I think that's a very important element as well. And we are very much interested also in further developing projects in collaboration with local authorities, but also with organizations like Represent Yourself, to think more about voter turnout campaigns for specific groups. How can we sort of make better use of those campaigns? What is the purpose of those campaigns? On the right, we have a picture of an article that we published in Groene Amsterdammer a few years ago on Represent Yourself. And I feel that article really well expressed the different strategies of Represent Yourself, but also explained how it's important to take the frustration, the anger, the exclusion that many people experience as a starting point for different campaigns. In order to be successful. As a first step, you first need to acknowledge the fact that, yes, these things do not go well. There are a lot of other problems. And I'm very happy to discuss this more with Yunus in the aftertalk. Thank you very much. So, Yunus,
yes.
Can you explain a bit what you guys did in the last elections and the extent to which you take into account some of the things that I just presented?
Yeah, so I think just to give you a bit of context also for the audience. So Represent Yourself is a grassrooted movement whereby we as a local group of entrepreneurs, creatives, content creators, we organize young people to talk about the elections with the ultimate goal to increase the turnout. I think that's has always been our strategy, and how that in practice looks like is that we organize a bunch of young people who are good with certain qualities and have the kind of ambition also to think about the coming elections and also understand that the issue in terms of that the voter representation of these specific groups that we all mentioned are extremely low. And that can also, because that's maybe also a question that I have for you, like why is this an issue? But we basically create digital campaigns through grassroots organizing. So we make content on TikTok and Instagram. And I think one thing about the second part of your question, what is like very important in your story is, I think one of the last things that you said is kind of the acknowledgement of, we don't say to voters that do not vote like that they are lazy or that they are the problem. No. You have to really start with like that acknowledgement of the sense of exclusion, the sense of that the political system is maybe so not only complex but also doesn't serve certain groups anymore. So you should acknowledge that. That's the first step. Because if you do not do that, then already a very large part of you already have lost a very large part of the population. Because whether it's perceived or not, there is a huge distrust against anything that has to do with government and politics, and sometimes these two are also intertwined in the image. So I think this is a very important part.
Yeah, but how do you remain optimistic about this, right? Because what we have showed, I guess, in the last 30 years, that participation as such doesn't really necessarily solve the problem, right? So how do you, because I guess that also the people that you speak with also know this, right? They say, well, why should I be bothered by voting? Because it doesn't really change the system.
True.
If we have the same parties running, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so I think this is a very relevant question that we have been trying to answer to ourselves after every election. Because after every election, it's been also a pretty disappointing. The turnout has never been like it didn't really like go up, you know. Well, we had some business projects that you can see growth. You see, okay, we have more results, so that's top. But with this, it's just all right. Here we go again. But then there's more of a question about whether we do it for these kind of results or we do it because it is important to do, right? Like sometimes, you kind of do stuff because you feel it as a citizen that it's also an obligation for groups that we are also a part of to say, hey, okay, maybe the system is fucked, if I can use this language, pardon it. Yeah. But it doesn't exclude us from that responsibility to also tell our communities to still get out there and vote. Yeah.
And how do you deal with the political parties? I mean, I can imagine that they are also interested to work with you guys because obviously you have this connection to these groups that potentially can vote.
Yeah.
At the same time, I guess also if you look at my presentation, the main message there probably is not so much towards the groups because they experience these things and they have sort of on the basis of that made their own choice. But it's much more that we sort of think, well, political parties need to reflect much more on what they are representing, how they are dealing with the population in the city, for instance. Is it also that you're in contact with political parties? And if so, how? And what could be also ways for us as academics, but also for you guys to perhaps also change that situation?
Yeah, so it was funny. Like a couple of years ago, I went to the raadsvergadering, like the city council meeting for the first time in my life. I was there, I've never been there. And then everyone came up to me and said, hey, you are from Amsterdam. I was like, okay, I didn't know that you actually knew us. But so I think a lot of like politicians are in our inbox, in our email or DM, asking for certain either like collaborations or advice, or because they know that we are kind of we can reach certain audiences, so they want to have this knowledge. We are very reserved on this because on one hand we have our community, we have about like 30,000, 35,000 like followers on different platforms and a lot of even more views to account for that. But we do not. We want to protect them from politicians because you can get like gekaapt, hijacked very soon. But informally, I speak to a lot of them, and I think the main message here is also that I totally agree with you, is that the political parties in our system, they have a certain gatekeeper they have element to them, which kind of like blocks any form of like kind of innovation that is very tough to kind of overcome. I think I even try to understand it from like going back to the constitution and what kind of like role political parties had. It's actually something that has just been kind of emerged in our political system, but it wasn't never really, I think, intended to have such a big role in like choosing candidates and letting candidates also run their own campaigns. So I don't know like what to do. Like I don't want to be too political on that side. This is an issue that we also don't know how to overcome.
Yeah. And I have another question for you in terms of your relationship with the city, right? I can imagine that local authorities very much welcome your activities and the stuff that you guys are doing, because it might lead to a situation where we have less inequality in terms of turnout.
Do you feel that support as well, financially or in other ways, or not? And how can we sort of deal with that situation?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. I want to go back to, again, the why question of why is this kind of important, right? Like, why does it matter that only 50% of the city turns out to an election, right? And from my perspective, or our perspective, is that to be a healthy democracy, yeah, you need to have everyone around it at the table of decision making to make a decision with draagvlak, with how do you say draagvlak? Support, yeah. So that's our start point. So then we also from this perspective we also talk with like the municipality, saying, hey, yeah, I think you also agree to this, right? You're maybe a politician or a wethouder or like a civil servant. Yeah, I would also, if I would be in their position, I would really love to have a backing of like the whole city to implement policy instead of just 50% of it. So they do understand this kind of like this necessity and this urgency and this problem. But then when it comes to also acting to it, there another dynamic emerges, which is more how I would say also a very power dynamic in terms of, okay, but what if we kind of invest in certain initiatives or campaigns or organizations or whatever to kind of reach out to those groups that are now underrepresented? What will actually happen when those groups actually turn up more? What happens to the new electoral reality?
Do they say it like that?
They don't say it like this.
But when you ask for money, for instance, you go to the city.
So
let's support. I mean, I guess those clips that you make, those campaigns, they cost money.
They cost money. Yeah. Definitely a lot of money.
And a lot of time, and you invest it yourself, right? But you need more support.
Yeah.
So they can give you that support.
Yeah. So it's also for us. It's been a political we're navigating. So we have been a lot of times unsuccessful because the language that they use in terms of like the neutrality, objectivity, these kind of words for civil service to kind of sell it to the council. We've been unsuccessful because they see us as a very specific group, like specific platform for a specific group. Sometimes we also have been successful because we've just been hustling our way into, okay, we can frame it like this. So we also play the political game, and I think this is also a lesson for us. We do not want to become too institutionalized. So if that means that municipality or central government is not willing to invest in us, that's okay. We will find partners in more philanthropic sides, or even like the private sector that also has still entrepreneurs that are willing to back these initiatives. So, and that's also fine for us.
Because I also understood that sometimes people perceive your campaigns to be a little bit too aggressive or too much focused on the negative part. That's when you say we acknowledge the fact that that you guys are frustrated, that you're disappointed in politics, and that should also be part of the campaign. That also, I guess, means that you will become very critical towards parties, political system.
And this is to make the circle round. This is exactly what you also mentioned in terms of that the acknowledgement side. It needs to be there. If you do not have like a very honest and genuine story towards voters that have been disenfranchised for a long time, you're not going to reach them. So we need to be on that like tipping scale a bit sharp on the knife. But then if the government also doesn't kind of like feel secure or comfortable with also pushing that message, then it's you're not going to get anywhere. We see a lot of like campaigns from the government that we think this is never going to reach the audience that they intend to. So that's like a spotting spell, like a field of tension. But that's we try to just be ourselves, and if they want to work with us, top. If not, we'll organize it in any way.
Yeah, but you remain optimistic in that sense, right? So that for the next elections, local elections, you guys will.
Yeah, of course, we'll be there.
Great.